What's up everybody, Greg here with Lensprotogo and Lens Rentals, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be going over the ZCam E2C, covering everything from the body, so all of the buttons and ports, and then diving a little bit into the menus and showing you how to get this camera set up and ready to shoot. A lot of these things that I'm going to talk about are going to transfer over from the E2C as well as into the E2, and I'll talk about a little bit of the body differences as we go through this. So diving right in and starting at the front of the camera, it has a micro four thirds mount with a micro four thirds sensor inside of it. And this is really great because there are a ton of lenses and ton of manufacturers that make micro four thirds lenses, and it keeps it in a really nice small form factor. Going on to the right side of the mount, you have 3 custom function buttons and then a power on off button. Now the thing about this camera, since it's so small and there's not a lot of buttons on it, some of these buttons act as multiple things. So the power on off also switches you into playback mode. So while the camera's on, if you just tap the power button, it'll bring you back into playback or review mode, and you can play back and watch your clips. The custom function buttons you can set up to be whatever you want. There's a ton of different features, and most of the time, whatever feature you set those up as, it's gonna go through multiples of those. So if you set it up for the exposure tools, it's gonna cycle through all the exposure tools by pushing that one button. So going through like zebras, false colors, things like that. Going around to the right side of the camera, you have an SD card slot, and this is where the E2 starts to vary. The E2 has a CFast card slot because it has some different recording options that need the higher speed cards. So this uses SD cards, which are quite a bit cheaper. It also has a bunch of 1/4-20 mounting points, and this is really great if you wanted to shoot vertical, so you can mount a plate directly onto that and mount the camera vertical if you're shooting for like Facebook or Instagram or something like that. Going around to the back side of the camera, you have a couple different things on here. You have your Wi-Fi antenna port, you have a USB-C port, and this is used so that you can record out to something like the Samsung T5 portable SSD. So if you want to have a bigger hard drive, this is a 2 terabyte, so I can record a ton on this, especially if you're doing longer form events. Underneath that, you have your 2-pin LEMO power in. And then on the other side, you have your remote port or your LANC cable. And then you have a LAN or Ethernet if you want to get these onto the internet and connect them up and do a bunch for a live stream. Now on the E2, there are a couple extra ports. There is a COM port, which is really great because it allows you to use a breakout cable similar to this one. And this gets you a ton of different options for SDI, power in, control, all kinds of stuff. And that really makes that one a little bit more advanced and for the professional use. You also get a mini XLR port on the side, which allows you to put audio in instead of just using the 1/8" jack. And then it also has an I/O port, again, for controlling the camera remotely, so you don't need to do it all on here. Going over to the left side of the camera, you're gonna have a couple more 1/4-20s, so you can mount the camera again in a vertical position if you wanted to, as well as having a headphone and a microphone input using that 1/8" jack. Going on to the bottom of the camera, you have a couple more 1/4-20s, again, just for mounting a plate and having more mounting options for this camera. Now moving on to the top of the camera, which is going to be where you're interfacing with this camera the most, you have a giant record start stop button, obviously to start and stop recording. You have a really nice little LCD screen which has all of your camera settings, and that's where you're going to do your navigation. But you can actually use it as a viewfinder and see what your composition and what your framing is. Down below that, you have a couple different buttons. You have your menu, your function button, which also acts as your ISO button. So if you want to change your ISO, you can hit that and then you use the up and down arrows. You have your shutter speed, EV, and then an OK button or a select button, as well as your up and down arrows, again, for menu navigation while you're using this camera. And the top of this camera is exactly the same on the E2, so everything I'm going to go through while walking through the menus is going to be almost identical. And that being said, let's dive into the top-down view and check out the menus. This camera has a surprisingly nice menu structure, and it's really easy to get set up. So starting with the interface that you're going to be greeted with when you first boot this up, you have your frame rate and your resolution in the top left corner. You have your SD card or CFast card letting you know that there's a card in there, or if there isn't. You have your Wi-Fi notification if you're on or off for Wi-Fi to be able to control over iOS. And then you have your battery voltage. Underneath that, you have some time code for what you're recording in, how long you've been recording, as well as some audio meters, so you can tell if audio is coming in. And it also has stereo meters, so there's a mic on either side of it, and you can tell if audio is coming from the left or coming from the right. Underneath that, you have all of your camera settings. So you have your ISO, which is at 1600 right now, your white balance, you have some exposure metering tools, your shutter speed, aperture, and exposure compensation if you want it over or underexposed if you're using auto exposure. And then you have your manual or autofocus setting. Now this is a nice little interface and shows you a lot of the information you want to know while you're shooting, but one of the things it doesn't show is what you're actually shooting. Now there's no specific button to do this. You actually have to use a combination of buttons. Holding down the FN and then hitting OK, it'll switch over into the viewfinder mode where you can actually see what's on your camera. Obviously this isn't good for being able to pull focus because the screen is so small, but it really helps with that composition and framing. And if you're using autofocus, the continuous autofocus with either human tracking or just center tracking, you're gonna be able to get some pretty good shots. Now that we've familiarized ourselves with the interface, let's jump in and start changing some of the settings. If you hit the menu button, it's going to get you into this grid mode where you have a bunch of different settings and options to change. The first one is your record mode. So if we hit OK to select to get into that, this is where we can change our resolution, frame rates, and file format. So we can go in here and change it from 4K to Cine 4K, which is DCI, so 4096 by 2160. And then there's also 4K and Cine 4K low noise. Now, if you checked out the test that I just did showing some of the footage using the low noise versus not using the low noise, it's pretty impressive how smooth this footage can get in those higher ISOs using the low noise format. So I'd definitely go and check that out. I'll throw a link to it up here if you want to check it out. But in here, yeah, there's some other options for different resolutions. You can do regular HD, you can do square format if you're looking for something for like Instagram, and then those 4K options. So let's just set it up with Cine 4K, so DCI. That's what I usually like to shoot in because I'm using the full sensor. And then if we hit the menu button, we can go back. And then if we go under that into the project frame rate, we can change this from 2997, 25, 24, or 2398. Now for my project frame rate, I almost always leave it at 2398. And then for off speed, I'll be able to switch it to 120 frames a second, but that will be in the variable frame rate, not in the project frame rate. So let's set that to 2398. Back out, file format, QuickTime or MP4. I like to use MOV because I edit on Mac. Down into this, split duration, this is to break the clip up if you're shooting for longer than 5 minutes. It'll split it into different groups so that if the camera powers down or something, you save all of that information. You have some time code settings, playback, frame rate, metadata setup. You can do all those things in there. Going back and going to the next one, this is the video, and this is where you actually change what codec you're shooting in. You change your variable frame rate, your bit rate, your rotation of the image if you want to rotate it, time-lapse modes, VER control. So let's go back up and we're going to look at the encoder settings. And in here you can see that we have ProRes options. Right now ProRes isn't supported on the E2C, even though you can see that in here. As soon as you put in an SD card, those get grayed out. You can shoot in H.265 and H.264. If you do want to use ProRes or shoot in Z-RAW, you have to go to the E2, not the E2C. Just a heads up on that. So we'll leave it in H.265 because that is the 10-bit codec. We'll go back and we can leave everything else in here set up. Going to audio, since I'm not using a microphone in, I'm just having the internal audio right now, I'm just going to leave it at that. But you could change it from the microphones to the 1/8 inch if you wanted to, or you could turn the audio off. You can change the input gain, and then you can turn on or off the level display if you don't want to see it. Back out of that and go to exposure. In here, this is going to be all of your exposure settings. So changing your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO, as well as your exposure compensation, and if you're doing auto exposure. So in here you can see we have our shutter speed set up to auto. I'm going to just change that to 1/48 because we're shooting in 2398. We're going to change the aperture to f2.8, so that's wide open on this lens. And then I'm going to change the ISO to 800. Now I'm not actually shooting anything, so obviously you can adjust this if you're actually shooting something. You can also set up the minimum and maximum ISO if you're using auto ISO for your exposure, as well as your max shutter speed, and then you change your exposure metering mode if you're using that auto exposure and how it's going to expose for the scene if you want it in a center point or if you want to do more of a general overall exposure average. So that's going to be what's in there. Going next to the white balance, you can change it in here obviously from auto to manual, and then you can do a Kelvin and a tint, and you can change the priority if you want it ambience or if you want it as white. Now I'm going to leave it on ambience because that's usually how I like to do it. One thing to note about the auto white balance is that it does seem to be quite a bit warmer if you're doing it in manual mode than what it's actually reading on here. So I was shooting the test that I did for the ISO and exposure, and I was shooting with a 5600 Kelvin light, and I had to have it set around 47 or 4800 Kelvin to get the proper white balance. Otherwise, it was way too warm. So just keep that in mind when you're shooting and possibly do some tests with this beforehand so you know what the image is going to look like when you get it. Going to the next menu, we have our focusing options. So this is where you can change it from manual to autofocus and then change those focusing zones, continuous autofocus, all of that. Going down to image, this is where you can set up the picture profile. So in here, we can change it from 709, we can do Z-log, flat, hybrid log gamma. I'm gonna switch it over to Z-Log 2 because that's gonna give me the flat, most dynamic range. You can also change some of the specific settings about that Z-Log. You can change the sharpness, brightness, saturation, things like that. Next up is your connection settings. And in here, this is where you can set up your network, your USB, and your HDMI. Now your network turns on the IP, which is where you can connect to it from your phone to be able to control it remotely. You have your USB and you can set it up as a host. You can set it up as mass storage, which is what you're gonna do if you're using that T5 Samsung SSD or any SSD using a USB-C. And then you have your HDMI, which is going to change the HDMI information and turn on or off the displays and all of these other settings in there. And then lastly, you have your system settings, and this is where you're going to clear the settings, so wipe the camera, format, turn on a LUT. If you're using that Z-Log, I highly recommend turning on a LUT. I like the V709. That one seems pretty realistic to what I'm actually getting once I put a grade on it in post. And then you can turn on D-Squeeze if you're using anamorphic lenses, set up some user profiles, change all of your user buttons in here to be whatever you want. There's a lot of different options in here. I'm just gonna go through some of them here. Exposure tools, white balance, shutter, magnifier, focus area, turn on or off LUT, all kinds of stuff. So definitely dive into those and play around with them. And then going out of that, you can turn on your record indicator. So this blinking light that you're seeing, it's blinking right now because I don't have an SD card in there, but it will be solid red when you're recording. Change the LCD brightness, change some powering options, set up your date and time, all of those normal camera settings. So that's basically it and everything you need to know to get this camera set up. I hope this video was helpful. If it was and you want to try this camera out for yourself and you're ready to take the dive, there's gonna be links in the description down below. Also check out those other videos that I mentioned because they're gonna be super helpful in sort of dialing in how you're shooting with this camera. If you guys have any questions about this camera, make sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you found value from this video, hit that like button, subscribe for new videos every single week, and I'll see you in the next one.